Prepare to delve into the mysterious world of ancient Greek legends and the subtle historical moments almost erased by time. These are stories like echoes of bygone centuries, resonating in marble halls, passed down by shepherds under starry skies, and carried through generations of dreamers. Let the day's hustle fade like mist over the Aegean Sea, and let the gentle ambient sound carry you away to distant realms. Our journey begins in ancient Greece, where even the gods sometimes required peaceful slumber. Many have undoubtedly heard of Pandora's box, that famous vessel said to have unleashed all the world's evils when curiosity overcame the first woman of humankind. But today we will slow down and immerse ourselves in the quiet moments that preceded everything changing forever. Imagine a humble stone cottage nestled in the hills beyond what would later become Athens. Morning light streams through wooden shutters, casting soft patterns on the clay walls. Pandora sits at her simple wooden table, her fingers tracing the smooth bronze surface of the box, which seems to hum with an energy she doesn't quite comprehend. She has been watching this box for 3 days. 3 long, silent days of contemplation. The gods presented it to her as a wedding gift, or so they claimed. Zeus himself, with his customary smile, placed it in her hands with a warning that felt more like a challenge. Never open this, dear Pandora. Promise me you never will. However, here's what the stories usually omit about those days of waiting. Pandora wasn't just battling curiosity, she was battling loneliness. Her husband, Epimetheus, toiled in the olive groves from dawn till dusk, his hands growing rough and dark from working the branches and testing the soil. Returning home, he was too weary for long conversations. He ate his bread and olives, perhaps mentioned the weather or a neighbour's goat, then fell asleep to the chirping of crickets in the garden. They were still learning to make a home together, so Pandora often found herself alone with the box. She traced the intricate engravings with her fingertips, spirals that seemed to shift when she wasn't looking directly at them, faces of creatures she couldn't identify, symbols that felt familiar though she was certain she'd never seen them before. Sometimes, late at night, as Epimetheus snored softly on their simple bed, she thought she heard something inside the box. Not voices, but a kind of whispering, like the sound of wind in leaves, or water flowing over sands, or perhaps the distant laughter of children playing a game she couldn't quite recall. On the morning of the 4th day, something shifted. Pandora woke before dawn, as she often did, and went to the small window overlooking the valley. The world was wrapped in that particular stillness that descends just before the birds begin to sing, when everything feels possible and nothing has yet gone wrong. She prepared her simple breakfast. Bread Epimetheus had traded for in the village, honey from the neighbours' bees, water from the spring that ran behind their home. But as she ate, her gaze kept returning to the box. Today it seemed different somehow. The bronze felt warmer, almost alive, and those whispers she thought she'd imagined were now distinctly there, soft but unmistakable. "We know you're listening," they seemed to say. "We know you understand." Pandora set aside her bread and slowly approached the table where the box waited. "What do you want?" she whispered, feeling a little foolish talking to an object, but somehow knowing it was the right thing to do. The answer wasn't words, but images that formed in her mind. She saw herself as the gods had made her, sculpted from clay and water, given breath and consciousness, blessed with gifts from each of the immortals. Athena had granted her wisdom, Aphrodite had bestowed beauty. Hermes had given her curiosity and the ability to speak persuasively. But what no story ever mentioned was that Hera had granted her the ability to sense when something was deeply, fundamentally wrong. And standing there in her small kitchen, as the morning light began to creep across the floor, Pandora suddenly understood that the box wasn't full of evils waiting to be released. It was full of truths someone didn't want the world to know. Her hands trembled as she reached for the small bronze clasp that held the lid shut. Not from fear, but from the weight of realization. The gods hadn't given her this box as a test of obedience. They had given it to her because they knew she was the only one brave enough to open it when the time came. The clasp was warm beneath her fingers, almost alive. As she began to lift it, she heard Epimetheus stir in the sleeping room, likely waking to another day of simple, honest labor in the groves. She paused for a moment, thinking of the life they led. Quiet, peaceful, untroubled by the complexities that seemed to plague the gods and their endless dramas. Part of her wanted to put the box away, pretend she'd never heard the whispers, spend her days learning to bake better bread and tending a real garden. But the whispers grew stronger, and she could distinguish individual voices. They weren't evil at all. They were sad, lonely. They had been locked away for so long, carrying truths that needed to be shared. One voice in particular caught her attention, softer than the others, but somehow more insistent. "I am hope," it said, "and I have been waiting for you, Pandora. The world will need me most." That's when she understood. The box didn't contain evil. It contained everything that makes life real. Pain and loss, yes, but also courage and hope, and the kind of love that grows stronger when tested. The gods had kept these things locked away because they wanted humans to remain simple and obedient, never venturing beyond what their creators had planned. But humans were made to grow. They were made to face challenges and learn from them, to experience sorrow and discover resilience, to confront injustice and choose to fight for something better. Now, with steady hands, Pandora opened the box. What emerged was not a storm of chaos, but something far more subtle, like the first breath of spring after a long winter. The whispers became gentle breezes that carried seeds of possibility across the world. Some of them would grow into challenges, yes, but others would blossom into innovation, art, philosophy, and deeper kinds of love than the gods could ever have imagined. Epimetheus found her there an hour later, sitting peacefully at the table, with the empty box before her. "You," he began, but she smiled and nodded. "I did what I was made to do," she simply said. And as they sat together, watching the sun climb higher over their valley, they both noticed something new in the morning light. It seemed brighter, somehow full of possibilities they had never considered before. Later that day they heard news from the village that made them smile. A young potter had discovered a new technique for making stronger clay vessels. A shepherd had figured out how to help his flock find better pastures. Two families who had feuded for years suddenly decided to work together on a project that would benefit everyone. The box had been full of potential, and now that potential had been released into the world, finding its way to anyone willing to embrace. Both the challenges and the opportunities that come with true living. But here's the part of the story that gets lost in all the retellings. Pandora never regretted opening that box, not even as she grew old and saw the world become more complex. When she saw people grappling with problems their simpler ancestors never had to face, because she also saw them solving problems, creating beauty, loving more deeply, and dreaming of a future their ancestors could never have imagined. And late at night, when she was very old, and the box sat empty on her table like an old friend, she could still hear the voice of hope, whispering in the wind that rustled through her olive trees, reminding her that no matter how dark the world seemed, someone was always ready to light a candle and keep going. As you settle deeper into your blankets tonight, perhaps you too can hear that whisper. Hope is still moving through the world, still finding its way to those who need it most. That whisper of hope, which had accompanied Pandora throughout her long life, travelled generations later to a simple farmer named Alexios, living in the rocky hills below Delphi, where the most famous oracle in ancient Greece delivered prophecies to kings and common folk alike. But Alexios never sought out the oracle with questions. Instead, he did something far more unusual. He made sure she had food to eat. Every morning, as the first rays of sun touched the peaks of Mount Parnassus, Alexios loaded his small wooden cart with fresh bread, goat cheese, olives from his 3 ancient trees, and whatever vegetables his stony patch of land could produce. The climb to Apollo's temple was steep and winding, but he had made the journey for 17 years, ever since he first saw the Pythia, the woman who served as Apollo's voice, looking thin and pale after an especially strenuous day of prophecy. Most people tended to picture the oracle at Delphi as a mysterious, almost otherworldly figure, speaking only in riddles while enthroned above swirling sacred vapours. Alexios, however, possessed a knowledge inaccessible to pilgrims or powerful kings. The Pythia, or Clio, was simply a woman, plagued by severe headaches after channeling the god's messages, and who often forgot to eat for days at a time. When he first brought her food, she looked at him with astonishment, and something akin to relief in her gaze. "Why?" she whispered, her voice still hoarse from the morning's prophecy. "Because even oracles need breakfast," he simply replied, carefully setting down the basket filled with warm bread and fresh cheese. Thus began their unusual companionship, if one could call it a friendship, where one conversed mostly in divine pronouncements and the other primarily about crop rotation, and whether the neighbour's goats had once again found their way into his carefully tended gardens. That morning, as Alexios guided his cart along the familiar winding path, his thoughts were occupied with the words Clio had spoken the day before. A wealthy merchant from Corinth had come to the oracle for advice, deliberating whether to invest in a new, promising trade route. And so, after Clio inhaled the sacred vapours and entered her prophetic trance, she had uttered, "The path that seems most golden will turn to dust, but the road built of small stones will safely lead you home." The merchant frowned, his face a picture of confusion, and demanded clarification. But Clio was already returning to her normal state, her gestures as she rubbed her temples clearly indicating the onset of another agonizing headache. So Alexios, without disturbing the silence, left his usual offering, bread, cheese, and a handful of early figs, and went home, pondering what Apollo had truly meant. Now, on his morning delivery, he found Clio sitting by the temple in the early sun, looking unusually thoughtful and introspective. "Good morning," he offered, unpacking his basket. "You look as if you've been wrestling with the gods all night." She smiled, accepting the bread he offered. Not the gods, Alexios, just trying to understand what they want people to hear. This was quite unusual. Cleo ordinarily remembered little of what she said during her prophetic trances. The messages passed through her, not from her, and afterward she felt drained and disoriented, like someone who had spoken a language they didn't truly know. "About yesterday's prophecy?" Alexios asked, settling beside her on the ancient temple steps. Cleo nodded slowly, breaking off a piece of bread and consuming it with the careful attention of someone who had forgotten to eat far too many times. Yes, the merchant asked about profit and trade routes, but it ended up being about building something lasting instead of chasing what merely glitters. Alexios considered this, watching the sun climb higher over the valley below. From where they sat, he could see his small farmstead, just a few terraced plots carved into the hillside, his humble red-tiled house, the stone walls he'd built with his own hands to keep his goats from wandering. Perhaps, he said at last, the god was telling him that true wealth comes from doing something useful and meaningful each day, rather than seeking one great instant fortune. Cleo looked at him with genuine interest. "You think that's what Apollo meant?" "I think Apollo speaks through you to tell people what they truly need to hear, not always what they want to hear. And perhaps that merchant needed to realize that getting rich quickly usually means someone else is getting poor quickly." They sat in comfortable silence for a while, eating bread and watching the world awaken below. A shepherd led his flock to pasture, treading the same path his father and grandfather had walked. Smoke rose from hearths in the village, where people began their daily tasks, baking bread, feeding animals, greeting neighbors, beginning another day of the small but profoundly important work that keeps communities alive. After a while, Cleo said, "You know, I've been thinking. You've brought me food for 17 years. Every morning, no matter the weather, you've never once asked me for a prophecy. Never wanted to know your future or get advice on your troubles. It never seemed necessary," Alexios replied. "I see my future quite clearly, as I do my past. Mostly I will plant seeds, tend them, mend what breaks, help my neighbors when they need it, perhaps find a wife someday. Perhaps not. Either way, there will be work, and there will be people to feed. But don't you want to know if your crops will fail, or if you'll find love, or how long you'll live?" Alexios considered this seriously. "If I knew my crops would fail, I would worry about it every day until it happened. If I knew they would succeed, I might grow lazy and not tend them properly. If I knew when I would die, I would spend all that time dreading it, instead of simply living." He paused, watching a hawk circle lazily overhead. "But one thing I know for certain." "What's that?" "Tomorrow morning, you'll be hungry again, and I'll be here with breakfast." Cleo laughed, a sound of pure delight echoing through the ancient temple walls. That is perhaps the most accurate prophecy anyone has uttered in Delphi for many years. As if summoned by their laughter, a young woman appeared on the path below, climbing towards the temple with the determined yet weary gait of someone carrying a heavy burden. Even from a distance they could see the tension in her shoulders, the way she kept stopping to look back, as if problems were pursuing her, from which there was no escape. "Another seeker," Cleo murmured, automatically shifting into her professional demeanor. But Alexios watched the woman more closely. "Look at her sandals," he said, "worn at the heels, and that cloak, once fine, but mended in several places. She has travelled far, and spent most of her money to get here." When the woman finally reached the temple, she was breathing heavily, trying not to show how exhausted she was. She approached Cleo with the formal gestures of someone who had rehearsed this moment many times in her mind. "Oracle of Apollo," she began, "I seek guidance." But Alexios stood and offered her his seat on the steps. "Sit first," he said gently. "Rest a while. Eat some bread and drink some water." The woman looked surprised, but gratefully accepted both the seat and the food. As she ate, her story came out in pieces. Her name was Thalia. Her husband had died in a farming accident, leaving her with 3 young children and debts she couldn't repay. She had sold almost everything she owned and walked for 12 days to reach Delphi, hoping for divine guidance on whether to remarry a man who could provide for her family, but whom she did not love, or to try and manage on her own, against all odds. When she finished speaking, Cleo prepared to enter the temple and consult the sacred vapors. But before she could rise, Alexios spoke. "Before you ask the god," he said to Thalia, "perhaps I could ask you something. What did you do before your husband died? What were you good at?" Thalia looked puzzled. I kept the house, raised the children, helped with the crops. I'm good at baking bread, and I know about herbs, medicinal ones, seasoning ones. People often asked me for remedies when their children were ill. And you walked for 12 days to get here? Yes. So you are strong, determined, and good at planning long journeys. You know about herbs and healing. You can bake, and you have successfully raised 3 children while helping to run a farm. Alexios looked at her seriously. "Thalia, you don't need a prophecy. You need a place where those skills are valued." He turned to Cleo. "How many pilgrims come here each day?" 20, 30, more in festival seasons. And they all need food, lodging, someone to tend to their weary, travel-worn feet and soothe their anxious minds before they consult the oracle. Understanding dawned in Cleo's eyes. "Thalia, what if your answer isn't in choosing between 2 difficult paths, but in creating a third? What if you stayed here in Delphi and opened an inn for pilgrims? You could use all your skills, support your children, and build something entirely your own." Thalia stared at them both. "I never thought, but I have no money to open an inn." "You have skills," Alexios said, "and this community needs what you can offer. Start small. Perhaps just offering bread and herbal teas to travelers. Let people know you are here, that you are reliable, that you care about their comfort. You build it stone by stone, day by day." Later, after Thalia had left to explore the village and consider this new opportunity, Cleo turned to Alexios, wonder in her eyes. That was better than any prophecy I could have given her. "Perhaps," Alexios said, "the best prophecy is simply helping people see what they already know, but were afraid to believe." As the sun reached its zenith and the day grew warm, Alexios prepared to descend the mountain to his work. But before he left, Cleo caught his hand. "Alexios, in 17 years, you've never asked me for anything, but I still want to give you something." She closed her eyes for a moment, not entering a prophetic trance, but simply listening to something deeper than the sacred vapors. "Your crops will sometimes fail, and sometimes they will flourish, as crops do. You may find love, or you may not. As life decides, you will live as long as you live, and it will be enough. But here is what I know for certain. Every morning you choose to climb this hill with food for a hungry person, you make the world a little more like the gods intended it to be. and that is a kind of immortality no prophecy can improve. The quiet legacy of Athens, the story of the salt walls. As he descended the winding mountain path, his empty cart bouncing cheerfully over familiar bumps, Alexios couldn't suppress a faint smile. He knew that the next morning, as soon as dawn broke, he would rise earlier than usual to load his cart to the brim with freshly baked bread and whatever his fertile garden had yielded, then set off for Delphi once more. It wasn't an oracle's decree or a mystical omen that compelled him on this path. No, rather, it was that deep, earthy certainty that requires no divine revelations, only a daily, conscious choice. Perhaps this was the simplest, yet most beautiful of all truths. The future isn't forged by grand gestures or mysterious insights, but shaped by the humble decision to show up tomorrow and do something useful for another person. This unwavering wisdom about the importance of daily presence, which guided Alexios on the mountain path to Delphi, somehow permeated the very foundations of Athens, and its source was something entirely unexpected. A 10-year-old girl named Myra, whose unusual occupation was collecting salt from tears. Of course, these weren't real tears, though the story itself begins with their abundance. Myra lived during the early formative period of Athens, when the city was still in the process of transforming from a mere cluster of dwellings, tightly grouped around a hill, into something far more significant. Her father, Nicias, was a skilled stonemason whose hands toiled on the great building projects that would one day make Athens famous. In those early days, however, his work mostly involved mending walls and laying foundations for modest city homes. Salt, naturally, was harvested from the sea, but delivering this precious mineral to the city proved far more challenging than one might assume. Myra's self-appointed task was to go to the harbour each morning. There, where salt merchants unloaded their wares, she would patiently collect the small crystals that spilled from torn sacks or fell through cracks in wooden crates. It was a humble task, one that adults often tended to overlook or deem insignificant. Yet Myra noticed something striking about this ordinary salt. Even a small amount could preserve food for many months. Just a pinch could flavour even stale bread, and when mixed with certain herbs, whose secrets her grandmother knew, salt could cleanse wounds and prevent infection. More importantly, she observed that buildings lasted longer in places where the ocean's salty spray settled into the mortar between stones. This observation might have remained a mere curious fact in a little girl's mind, were it not for the events that unfolded during the Great Wall project when she was 11 years old. Athens was growing, and with that growth came a pressing need for improved defences, not only against invading armies, though that was a serious concern, but also against the destructive floods that occurred every few years, when winter rains overflowed the rivers, and against the earthquakes that periodically toppled city structures. The city council commissioned a new section of defensive wall, and Nicias was chosen as one of the lead stonemasons for this massive undertaking. He felt pride in the appointment, but also anxiety. The materials provided for the construction were good, but not exceptional. The stones were local limestone, workable enough but prone to cracking. The mortar was a standard mix of lime, sand, and water. It would build a functional wall, but likely not one that would last for centuries. Myra watched the work closely, her mind constantly returning to those salt-fortified stones at the harbour. One evening, as her father sat on the doorstep, cleaning mortar from his hands and lamenting the small cracks already appearing in the day's work, she ventured a suggestion. What if we mixed salt into the mortar? Nicias looked at his daughter with the patient expression adults use when children suggest impossible things. Salt costs money, little mouse, and even if we could afford it, who knows if it would help or harm. But Myra had been collecting her spilled salt for months, storing it in clay jars in her small pantry. She had enough to make a test batch of mortar, and she had a clear idea of how to prove it would work. Behind their house was a low retaining wall that held back a small garden terrace. It was a minor thing, something that wouldn't matter much if it collapsed. With her father's permission, she mixed a batch of the salted mortar and repaired a section of that wall. Then she simply waited. The first test came with the autumn rains. The regular mortar in other parts of the wall softened and cracked where water collected, but Myra's salted section remained firm and intact. The second test came with the winter frosts, when ice formed in tiny crevices between the stones. Again, the salted section remained solid and unbroken, while the traditional mortar cracked and crumbled, losing its integrity. By spring, even the most skeptical stonemasons in the city, those who had initially scoffed at her idea, were talking about the little girl who had figured out how to create mortar that could withstand the harsh weather that eroded everything else. But here is where the story takes a truly unexpected and fascinating turn. Myra wasn't interested in personal gain from her discovery. Instead, she presented a proposal to the city council that was so unusual, the officials barely knew how to react. She proposed organizing the children of Athens to collect salt at the harbor, using the same method she herself had employed for years. It wouldn't just be her, but dozens of children who could earn a little money while contributing to something truly important. The city, in turn, would buy this salt at fair prices. The amount wouldn't be enough to make anyone rich, but enough for the children to feel the value of their labor. And instead of keeping the salted mortar technique a secret, she would teach it to any stonemason who wished to learn the knowledge. The council was perplexed. But why give away something so valuable? Asked Councilman Demetrius, voicing the general confusion. You could charge premium prices for salt-reinforced construction and make a significant profit. Myra, now 12, and growing into a thoughtful young woman who chose her words carefully, stood before the assembled adults and patiently explained her logic. If only the wealthy can afford lasting buildings, then only the wealthy can build things that matter and endure. But if everyone knows how to make stronger mortar, then everything we build, walls, homes, workshops, temples, all becomes more durable. The entire city becomes stronger and more resilient. She paused, looking around the room at the men who made the most important decisions for Athens. Besides, I was thinking about time. My father says a good wall should last for his grandchildren to see it. But what if we could build walls that would last for our grandchildren's grandchildren? What if every person who builds something in Athens knows that they are contributing to something that will be here centuries from now, that their work will leave a mark for ages? The idea, slowly but surely, took hold, as truly good ideas often do. At first, a few stonemasons began experimenting with the salted mortar on their own projects, with cautious interest. Then word of the miraculous technique spread to other cities, from which builders began to travel to Athens to learn this innovative method. Within a few years, Athenian mortar became synonymous with durable and reliable construction, its reputation growing with each new building. But the real change wasn't just in the strength of the structures being built. It was in how people came to view their work, how their attitude towards labor shifted. When a person realizes that what they are building could stand for centuries, they begin to pay attention to the smallest details that might otherwise be overlooked. They choose materials more carefully and thoughtfully. They spend extra time to make precise measurements, striving for perfection. They begin to think deeply about how weather and relentless time will affect their work, how it will endure the test of years. More than that, they begin to think about the people who will use what they have built, long after they are gone, about the future generations for whom their labor will become a legacy. Myra, now a grown woman married to a potter named Lysander, often walked through the city and pointed with particular pride to buildings where her unique salted mortar technique had been used. However, she found special joy and satisfaction in looking at the small but important structures, neighborhood walls that kept children's play areas safe, market stalls that provided shelter for elderly vendors, public fountains that offered clean, fresh water to all. You see, she would tell her children, when you make good things available to everyone, the whole world around becomes more beautiful and harmonious. The salt walls of Athens became famous throughout Greece. Their renown was due not only to their exceptional strength, but also to what they symbolized. Here was a city where a child's observation was taken seriously, where innovation was not hidden but generously shared with everyone, where every building project was viewed as an invaluable gift to future generations. Visitors often asked to be shown the great salt walls, expecting to see some grand fortress or monumental temple, but the Athenians would merely smile and point around them, to sturdy homes, reliable market buildings, to neighborhood walls that had withstood decades of storms and earthquakes without faltering. All of them, they would say with pride, every wall in Athens is now a salt wall. And late at night, as the city slept, one could almost hear the buildings themselves whispering their gratitude to the little girl who paid attention to spilled salt, to the stonemasons who were willing to learn from a child, to the community that chose longevity over immediate profit. The walls of Athens still stand in many places, their salt-reinforced mortar as strong today as it was centuries ago. And perhaps that is the most beautiful part of this quiet and humble story, that somewhere, right now, in the moonlight, those ancient stones continue to do their work, protecting and sheltering, built by people who understood deeply that the most important work is that which endures long after we are gone, creating an eternal legacy. The profound understanding of longevity that Myra had once woven into the very fabric of Athens manifested decades later in one of the city's most ambitious building projects ever conceived. This project was the temple later known as the Parthenon, majestically rising on the Acropolis above Athens. However, this narrative doesn't focus on the celebrated architects or virtuoso sculptors, whose artistry gave the Parthenon its incomparable beauty. It centers on a 9-year-old boy named Damon, whose duty involved entering spaces too cramped for adult builders, and who noticed something almost everyone else overlooked. Damon was one of the so-called gap boys, a handful of children hired on the construction site to scramble through narrow passages between scaffolding, retrieve dropped tools, and inspect areas where adult men couldn't fit. The work was considered mostly safe and earned enough to help his widowed mother purchase food and maintain their humble apartment near the agora. He had a particular fondness for his work, especially the climbing. Each morning the boy would ascend the wooden scaffolding that surrounded the growing temple like a dense forest of pine poles and ropes, and spend his day navigating the labyrinth of the burgeoning structure like a small, cautious spider. From that height he had a view of all Athens spread out below, the red-tiled roofs of homes, the green plots where people tended gardens, and in the distance the harbour where ships arrived daily with marble from the islands and timber from northern forests. But more than the view itself, he was drawn to the feeling of being part of something truly grand and eternal. Every marble block taking its place, every column reaching for the sky, every carved detail emerging from a sculptor's chisel, all became part of a creation destined to outlast everyone who laboured upon it. Damon had been on the site for almost a year when his attention was drawn to an imperfection in the roof's design. It was a barely noticeable detail, one that could only be discovered by spending days crawling across the upper reaches of the scaffolding. The marble beams intended to support the roof were magnificently crafted, perfectly cut, precisely fitted, strong enough to bear the heavy tiles and decorative elements that would complete the temple. However, they possessed one minor flaw that could evolve into a major problem. Each beam had been carved with a slight upward curve, designed to counteract the natural tendency of heavy stone to sag over time. This was a thoughtful engineering solution, a detail that distinguished skilled master builders from ordinary ones. But in the narrow channels meant to carry rainwater off the roof, this curve created tiny depressions where water would collect, rather than flowing freely away. For most of the year this wouldn't have mattered. Athens had a dry climate, and most rains came as short, intense downpours that quickly ran off any roof. However, Damon had lived through several winter seasons when continuous heavy rains could last for days, and he knew what happened to marble when water stood for long periods in small depressions. It slowly cracked, subtly at first, but inevitably. The problem was that no one else seemed to have noticed, and Damon was just a 9-year-old gap boy. The chief architect, Ictinus, was renowned throughout Greece for his unparalleled skill and precision. The foreman, Callicrates, had overseen the construction of dozens of significant structures. The marble carvers were true artists whose creations were destined to be admired for centuries. Who was he, then, to suggest they had made a mistake? For several days, Damon wrestled with his worry alone. He climbed to inspect the roof structure during meal breaks, running his small fingers along the channels meant to carry water, measuring the tiny depressions with bits of string, trying to convince himself he was wrong. But the more he looked, the more certain he became that these minor imperfections would eventually destroy the temple from above, much like termites gnawing away at a house from within. Finally, he resolved to approach Phidias, the master sculptor who oversaw all the artistic aspects of the building. Phidias was known for his patience with young workers and had a reputation for listening to ideas that came from the most unexpected sources. Damon found the great artist resting in the shade of the scaffolding, sketching designs for one of the pediment sculptures that would crown the completed temple. It took all of Damon's courage to interrupt him. "Master Phidias," he began, his voice softer than he'd intended. "Might I show you something that troubles me?" Phidias looked up from his sketches, a kind expression on his face, like someone who genuinely enjoyed teaching. "Of course, young Damon, what troubles you?" Instead of trying to explain with words, Damon led the sculptor through the scaffolding to the roof level, where the marble support beams stretched across the temple's width like the ribs of some colossal creature. "Look here," Damon said, pointing to one of the drainage channels. "When it rains, the water will run down from the highest point of the roof. But when it reaches these low spots, it won't keep going. It will just sit there." Phidias knelt beside the boy and ran his experienced fingers over the marble surface. After a moment, he took out a small bronze tool and allowed a few drops of water from his drinking cup to trickle down the channel. The water moved smoothly at first, then pooled exactly in the spots Damon had predicted. "How long have you noticed this?" Phidias asked, his voice now serious. "Several weeks. I kept hoping I was wrong, but every time I check, the water collects in the same spots." Phidias was silent for a long time, looking at the city below, then back at the roof structure, which represented months of careful planning and costly work. "Damon," he said at last, "I need you to show this to Master Ictinus right now." What followed was one of the most intense conversations in the history of the Parthenon's construction. Ictinus, faced with undeniable evidence that his roof design had a potentially catastrophic flaw, went through a gamut of emotions, from disbelief to anger to something akin to panic, before settling into the focused determination of a master who needed to solve a problem. The solution, when they found it, was elegant but costly. Every affected marble beam would need to be removed, transported back to the carvers' workshops, and recut with slightly deeper drainage channels that would carry water past the low spots. This would add months to the construction schedule and require several skilled craftsmen to redo work they thought was perfectly finished. The alternative, however, a temple that would slowly destroy itself from rainwater damage, was unthinkable. As the rework began, Damon became something of a celebrity on the construction site. Workers who had barely noticed him before now sought his opinion on their own minor issues and observations. But more importantly, the experience changed everyone's approach to the building process. Ictinus instituted a new practice. Each week, workers of all levels, from master craftsmen to gap boys, would gather to discuss anything they had noticed that was unusual or potentially problematic. No observation was deemed too minor to mention. No worker was too young to speak up. In this way, they discovered dozens of small improvements. A stone carver noticed that morning sunlight revealed chisel marks invisible in full daylight, leading to a shift in sculptors' work schedules. A scaffolder suggested a different knot that would make support ropes less prone to stretching in wet weather. An older marble polisher shared a technique for detecting hairline cracks, invisible to younger eyes. Each improvement was minor in itself, but together they transformed the Parthenon from merely a beautiful building into something approaching perfection. Years later, when the temple was completed and had safely weathered its first decade of Athenian seasons, Damon, now a young man learning the stone carver's trade, often climbed to the roof level to inspect the drainage channels that had so troubled him as a child. The water now flowed smoothly, carrying away each season's rains without a trace. The marble beams remained strong and flawless, supporting their burden of tiles and decorative elements with the patient strength that good architecture provides. But the most beautiful part of these roof visits wasn't the technical excellence of the repair. It was the knowledge that hundreds of other workers also felt empowered to notice, to question, to contribute their own observations to the creation of something magnificent. The Parthenon became famous for its proportions, its sculptures, its architectural innovations. But among the builders themselves, it was also remembered as the first great project where wisdom, it was understood, came from anyone who listened closely, regardless of age or status. And late at night, as moonlight illuminated the temple's columns and cast long shadows across the Acropolis, one could almost hear the building itself breathing, taking in the cool night air and releasing the day's warmth, its perfect drainage carrying away the dew that formed on the marble surfaces. Every part worked in harmony because a 9-year-old boy cared enough to speak up about what he noticed. The Parthenon still stands today, its roof still shedding rain effectively, just as it did 25 centuries ago. A testament that the most important insights sometimes come from the smallest voices, if we are wise enough to listen. The wisdom concerning the careful perception of subtle signals, which, according to legend, saved the Parthenon's roof and transformed Athens' approach to grand undertakings, found its home in a truly unexpected corner. It permeated the atmosphere of a humble celebration, long since faded from popular memory, dedicated to the noble olive trees that stretched across the city's surrounding hillsides. This festival bore the name Eleaphoria, literally meaning olive-bearing, and it was held annually, coinciding with the official start of the harvest of these precious fruits. Unlike the lavish Panathenaea, accompanied by grand processions and solemn sacrifices, or the dramatic Dionysia with their theatrical performances and contests, the Eleaphoria was an intimate local event. Its essence lay in honouring what most city dwellers had come to take for granted, the trees that generously provided oil for lighting homes, served as a source of sustenance and medicine, and were an important element of trade operations. However, in that particular year to which our narrative turns, something extraordinary occurred that transformed this humble celebration into one of the most poignant and memorable events in the annals of Athenian history. The catalyst for this astonishing metamorphosis was an elderly woman named Philomena, who with tireless care tended a grove of ancient olive trees, spread across the hilly slope overlooking the city. These trees were no ordinary specimens of their kind. Legends held that they traced their lineage back to the very first olive tree that the goddess Athena had brought forth from the Acropolis rock during her rivalry with Poseidon for patronage of the city. Whether this legend was literally true held little importance for Philomena. Far more significant to her was that these trees boasted venerable age, some several centuries old, and that they yielded the most exquisite oil in all of Attica. Their mighty, gnarled trunks and delicate silver-green leaves had silently watched as Athens, once a humble settlement, grew into the greatest polis in all of Hellas. But it was that autumn that Philomena sensed something unsettling, something that disturbed the usual order of things. Although the trees bore an abundant harvest of olives, the fruits themselves, for some reason, looked different. They were smaller than usual, and had a bitter taste not present in previous years. At first she surmised the weather might be to blame. The summer had been drier than usual, and perhaps the trees were suffering from a lack of life-giving moisture. However, as harvest time approached, a suspicion grew in her that something else, something deeper, was at play. The trees, it seemed to her, were saddened. Such a statement might have seemed the eccentricity of a lonely old woman spending too much time alone with her green charges, but Philomena had dedicated 60 years to tending olive groves. She knew these particular trees far better than most people, and had learned to read their condition and mood with the same insight that others recognize emotions on human faces. When the trees were well, after abundant rains, in rich soil, or during peaceful times when Athens was not at war, their olives were plump and sweet, and the oil golden and fragrant. In times of stress or neglect, the fruits became small and bitter. But this year felt entirely different. This year the trees seemed to mourn, radiating an inexpressible sorrow. As Eleaphoria inexorably approached, Philomena made a decision that astonished even herself with its unusualness. Instead of performing the traditional ritual in the seclusion of her grove, she loaded a cart with branches cut from her oldest trees, branches laden with small, as if sorrowful, olives, and brought them directly into the city. She set up her simple cart in the agora, not with the intention of selling anything, but solely so that citizens could see and touch the olive branches, originating from trees that had already been growing when their great-grandparents were still children. These trees hold memory, she proclaimed to all who would listen. They remember when your ancestors first walked on Athenian soil. They remember the taste of the earth when it was far richer, and the melodic singing of many birds in the mornings, and how people regularly came to them to inquire about their health. At first the citizens were polite, but remained distracted in their thoughts. The bustling agora hummed with life, and most shoppers were absorbed in running specific errands. Gradually, however, something remarkable began to happen, as if an invisible thread was starting to connect people to a forgotten past. An elderly potter named Theron lingered by the cart to examine the olive branches closely, and soon began sharing stories of trees his grandfather had planted beyond their home's walls. A young mother, arriving with twins, found her children utterly captivated by the varied shapes of the olive leaves, and caught up herself, began explaining the process of making olive oil to them. Even a merchant, accustomed to trading exotic luxuries imported from distant Egypt and Persia, paused to deeply inhale the distinctive aroma of fresh olive, and suddenly found himself lost in memories of his own childhood, helping his father with the harvest, feeling the weight of the sacks, hearing the satisfying rustle of ripe fruits falling from the branches, recalling the whole family working together during the picking season. By midday, a quite noticeable crowd had gathered around Philomena's cart. However, these people weren't just passively listening to her stories. They were actively sharing their own memories, asking questions about the nuances of tree care, openly discussing the groves and gardens that had been abandoned or that they had never learned to properly tend. It was at this point that Philomena voiced her momentous proposal. "What," she inquired, addressing the gathering, "if instead of merely preserving an unseen connection between Athens and its trees, we revive it? What if this Eleophoria transforms not just into a festival celebrating the harvest, but into a day when every citizen takes the time to visit the olive groves, touch the earth, remember that our civilization springs from the very same soil as our trees?" The idea, like a spark, ignited instantly, as truly inspiring concepts often do. Within hours, small groups began to form, heading for the olive groves spread across the hills surrounding Athens. Families who hadn't visited their ancestral trees in years suddenly decided to make the journey. Young people who had never before witnessed the olive harvest suddenly showed a keen interest in this ancient practice. Even city officials joined this informal pilgrimage, including the Archon himself, who typically spent festival days participating in ceremonial services at the temples. What they discovered in the groves surpassed all their expectations. The trees, surrounded by a number of people unseen in decades, seemed to respond to the attention. Olives that had appeared small and bitter that morning now seemed plumper, more fragrant,